So one of the questions I get asked most is, what is my color correcting process to achieve the vibrant saturated colors in my image? And the honest truth is, I don't do a whole lot of color correcting. Just as important as the color correction you do in post, in fact, if not more important, is your in-camera settings and making sure the colors look good directly out of camera. Now, I'm a big Canon guy because I love the colors that you can achieve straight out of camera. I think they have tremendous color science. I've used Sony cameras, I've used Red cameras, I've used all kinds of different cameras, and I love the look straight out of camera that you can get with Canon. So first, let me talk about the in-camera settings I use to achieve great colors straight out of camera. The first is your picture profile settings. I use a standard profile with my sharpness all the way down to 0, my contrast down to, saturation 0, and color tone 0. The next thing that's going to affect your color is your white balance. Now, I rarely use an auto white balance because your camera is going to be guessing what's best, and sometimes it's not always going to guess correctly. So when I'm shooting outdoors, in the sunlight, I like to shoot between 5600 and 6000 Kelvin. And when the sun's gone behind some clouds or I'm shooting in shade, I will usually shoot a little bit higher, around 7 to 8000 Kelvin. And indoor will usually be between 3000 and 4000 Kelvin. The third thing is setting your exposure correctly, not having your highlights too blown out and not having your shadows or your blacks too crushed. So, assuming you have done those three things well, you should end up with an image that looks something like this. This is a video I shot in Kauai, Hawaii for Cotopaxi. It was a beautiful saturated island as is, and so it made my job easy. However, it does help when you're using correct settings and can give it an extra punch in post with your color correction process. So, without further ado, here's my post-production color correction process. The first thing I do is I add Lumetri color, which can be found in the Effects tab, and you just type in Lumetri color, and you'll see it right here in the color correction subfolder, Lumetri color. Select your clip and then double click on Lumetri, and it will pop up in your effects controls up here in the top left, giving you 5 toggle downs. The only ones I use are basic correction, curves, and sometimes a vignette. For this image, I'm just going to use a basic correction and a curve. So toggle this down, and the first thing I'm going to do is just boost my saturation just a tad. I generally use between 110 and 120. We'll use 120 for this image. Once I've boosted my saturation, I will look at my image and I will see how it looks, and I'm looking at the skin tones here and the dirt here, and it's looking a little bit Oompa Loompa-ish, a little bit too red-orange for me. So to compensate for that oversaturation I just plugged into my image, I'm going to come up to my white balance color temperature gauge, and I'm going to just bring this down about 10-12 notches. That allows me to boost the saturation of the entire image without making the skin tones look too Oompa Loompa-ish. So that's something I do often, is if I want a more saturated image, I will usually just bring my color temperature down, cool it down just a little bit to compensate for those overbearing oranges in the skin tones, and it will help me bring out all the other colors while keeping those skin tones fairly the same. Moving on to the next effect is the most common one I use, which is called curves or RGB curves. And with RGB curves, what I'm usually doing is creating an S curve, which means I select a key point in my highlights and a key point in my shadows. I bring my highlights up just a tad, and I bring my shadows down just a tad. Now this image is a little bit brighter to bring your highlights up, so I'm actually going to bring my highlights back down and my shadows down farther. So that all I've really changed here are the shadows, not so much the highlights. The highlights to me were already bright enough. So that's what curves does, and you can toggle the effect on and off by clicking this active check mark, and you can see what that curves has done to your image, just crushing your shadows a little bit and giving that image a little bit more punch. Now if you come up to the top here and you see the FX next to Lumetri color, you can toggle that on and off, which will allow you to see all the corrections you've made, the before and after, and as you can see, we now have a much punchier and more saturated look to this image. It was already good in camera, and we just made it a little bit better in post. Every once in a while, I will come into this hue saturation curve. I'll select 2 points for just this one color, which is blue in this case, and you can see over there in the left top corner that the blues are the only color being affected when I use this effect. So if I want to bring out the blues in my sky, that is something I will use at times as well. So we'll go ahead and punch the sky just a little bit. And lastly, at times I will use the vignettes. On this one I chose not to, but I'll usually put it on between 0 and -5. On this one, I'd probably just do a -2. And as you can see, that just puts a little bit of darkening around the edges. It kind of draws your eye into the middle where your subject is. I'm not going to put a vignette on this one. I think it's fine as is. So I'll come back up here to the FX button next to Lumetri Color, toggle it on and off, make sure I like my look, and then I'll move on to my next clip. So that is the basic color correcting process I do for most of my clips. It's not that difficult, not that fancy. Hopefully that will help you in your color correcting process. I'm just going to take you to a couple different examples here of similar images so you can see how I use the effect a little bit differently in other areas. So I come to my color Lumetri, I double click it, I will toggle down my basic correction, and I will start again by boosting up my saturation. We'll go to 120 again this time, and once again I feel like we're just a little bit too warm now with that boosted saturation, so I'm going to bring the temperature down to about 10 to offset that so that her skin tones aren't looking overbearing. And as I toggle that on and off, you can see all those colors coming to life. Look at the yellow in the water bottle and the green in the plants, and the blue in her shirt just stands out, and even the hair on the back of her head that's kind of tinted by the sun. All the colors just pop, and yet the skin tones aren't changing that much. And that's kind of what I'm going for, is I don't want to affect those skin tones too much. I want to keep them natural and neutral while still boosting the vibrance and saturation and all the awesome colors around her. Now you'll notice in this image, because there is so much green around her, there's kind of a green tint in the image as a whole. So I'm going to go ahead and boost my tint. I don't always play with the tint, but sometimes when I feel like there's a green or a red hue on the image as a whole, I will bring this adjustment up or down. Up brings in more red, down brings in more green. I'm going to bring in a little bit more red because I feel it's a little too green. So I'm just going to bring this up just a tad. We just want a little bit of red there. We'll maybe go to 8 or 9. Toggle that on and off to see how it looks, and look at the green hue in her face on the beginning one. It just makes her look kind of sick, kind of pale with that green tint on there. So by putting a little bit more red into the image, you see that it makes her face look a little bit more healthy, a little bit more tan, and so that's the look we're going for by adding some red to the image. Now let's come down to our curves again, and once again I'm going to select a keyframe on my shadows and one on my highlights. And just so you can see what this is doing, when I boost up my highlight side, it's taking everything that's bright in the image and making it brighter, or bringing it down to be dimmer. And when I use this side, it brings everything that's dark in the image and makes it darker, and everything that's dark in the image and making it brighter. So that's what these curves do for you. And an S-curve is meant to make the image more contrasty and punchy, which is a look I like. So I'm just going to bring this up to make an S, and we're just going to punch that image just a little bit. That might be a little bit too much. We start to see her face blowing out a little bit right there. So I'm going to bring this down just a tad. A little bit goes a long way. So let's come back up to the top, look at our effect as a whole, toggle on and off FX next to Lumetri Color, and we'll see the before and after of everything we've applied, and it's looking a lot more appealing now. Now you might prefer and say, you know what, I think your style is a little bit too saturated, and so I'd rather have it be a little bit less like this. This is simply preference, and it comes down to the project you're doing. There are certain projects you want to be vibrant and beautiful and saturated and happy, like this one for me. And there's projects that you're not going for that look. It's maybe a more dramatic video, and so you're not going to want vibrant, happy colors because it doesn't fit your story. So make sure you understand why you're choosing the colors you are, and you're not always going to be choosing vibrant, happy, saturated color tones like I have for this video. Now, I want to look at one more example of a GoPro shot, because I often get asked, how do you make your GoPro shots look good? So I'm going to grab my Lumetri Color. We are going to pop it on. Now the first thing you notice is that this image is very dull, very flat. So first I'm going to boost up my saturation like I usually do. And with these GoPro shots, you can actually bring it up a little bit more because it has a flatter picture style and camera. And the second thing I'm going to do is come into my curves, and the image as a whole is too bright, so I'm going to bring down both of these, not just my shadows, but my highlights as well. Maybe not that much on the highlights, maybe about right there. So it's still in an S-curve shape, but I've brought my highlights down just a little bit because the image as a whole is too bright. But it's in the general shape of an S with the highlights higher than the shadows, which will create a punchier, contrastier look. So we'll say that's pretty good right now for the S-curves. But now I feel like because of the boosted saturation, our skin tones are looking a little bit green and a little bit Oompa Loompa-ish. So we're going to correct that by bringing our temperature down and our tint up. And as you can see, that does a good job to correct those colors and make them look more natural. And now let me toggle on and off to see our before and after. And holy smokes, can you see the difference there? And all I've done is bring my temperature down, my tint up just a little, my saturation up, and played with this S-curve to correct the exposure. So that's a pretty simple basic color correction for a GoPro shot. You're going to get that a lot with GoPro, just a flat kind of crappy looking image. It can be fixed. It's easier than you think. Those are the only steps I've used to achieve this look. So even if in camera your image doesn't look that good, you can correct that footage and bring it back to something usable. So that's it for my color correcting process. That's basically what I do for every single clip. If you guys have any further questions, please let me know.